Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Build St. Louis, the regional podcast that's capturing and sharing the very heartbeat of the construction industry. And I'm your host, Kerry Smith, owner of Construction News and Review magazine. And if you are a building owner or building operator or anyone who inhabits a building during the workday, you're going to want to listen closely to what our experts have to say today. We're talking about the Building Energy Performance Standard. And here to explain exactly what that is and what it requires are two professionals from a company known as Integrated Facility Services, or IFS. Jeremy Welch is a project engineer and an energy specialist with IFS and has been with the firm for 15 years. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, and he is the current president of the Association of Energy Engineers for the St. Louis, Missouri chapter. And Chris Ruth is IFS's Mid-Missouri Controls Manager. He's been with IFS for nearly 20 years, and he is the past chairman of the board of the Missouri Gateway Green Building Council, a chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council. And gentlemen, it's great to have both of you here with us today. Thank you for the time and the expertise you're going to share.
Thanks, Kerry. We appreciate it.
Sure thing. Let's jump right into it, Jeremy and Chris. And for anyone who hears the term Building Energy Performance Standard and, like me, was not familiar with it closely, what is the BEPS and why is 2024 a significant year for what it requires?
Sure. So the Building Energy Performance Standard it can be very complex, and we'll just look at it as from on a smaller scale. The Building Energy Performance Standard is a standard that was put in place for the city of St. Louis that requires all buildings over 50,000 square feet to benchmark. As part of that benchmarking process, the buildings will identify their energy use intensity, which Jeremy will talk a little bit more about what that is, but that EUI score is set for each building after they benchmark. Now, what the Building Energy Performance Standard does is it takes all of the buildings of a certain type, whether it's places of worship, multi-use office, warehouse, refrigerated warehouse, education, and so forth, and it groups all those together. And it takes the top third or the top 33% of those buildings and takes an average of their EUI score. And that EUI score is the target that the other buildings, the bottom 2/3, have to work toward in terms of improving their EUI score. So it's a floating scale, and it's something that is going to be used for years to come. We're in the middle of the first cycle of the Building Energy Performance Standard. There's a few more cycles to come. The reason 2024 is such an important year in this first cycle is this is the first analysis year that we'll see under this Building Energy Performance Standard. So the calendar year of 2024 will be analyzed at the end of the year, and that will determine each building's EUI score for that year. So now is the time, as we get further into 2024, older building systems or poor performing building systems will have a longer impact on the analysis for 2024. So we want to address those as early as possible to try and get the majority of 2024 under the best performance possible.
I appreciate that intro, Chris. So really it's tied to the efficiency of building systems like heating, ventilating, air conditioning. I'm not sure what the other systems are involved in. Jeremy, I bet you're going to dive into that, but how does all that tie into what you guys had mentioned, which is the EUI? I just forgot what it stood for again. Tell me again the EUI score, and Jeremy, kick it off for us.
The EUI is the energy use intensity. It's a score that is measured in the amount of energy that a building used over the course of a year divided by its total square footage. So that gives this score, so to say, of this energy intensity. And what they can do is that allows buildings to compare against other buildings that are used in a similar fashion. If you got an office building, you can compare it with other similar office buildings, even though they may be different square footages. That kind of balances it out so that both are looking at somewhat of a similar score. So that allows you to compare yourself to these other types of buildings. You don't want to compare an office building to a hospital, right? So
Right.
you're going to want to make sure that you're comparing to similar uses yourself.
That makes sense. And I know we're talking more about St. Louis, but is this something across the country that is emerging as across the nation and really the world globally, we're trying to be more efficient with our energy use, or is it just specific to St. Louis?
Yes, these standards and benchmarking standards are popping up more and more. St. Louis is, I want to say, the third major city to adopt a standard like this, and we're seeing smaller communities, municipalities, and other cities across the country that are adopting this as well. Those that have already started to use a program like this have seen improvements in their energy consumption regionally or locally, and have seen the benefits.
The big question, I guess, as professionals, does IFS go in and assist building owners to do like an assessment to see where they're at and where they would need to be in terms of efficiency to comply with the standards? What's your interaction with building owners that are needing to deal with this?
So currently, yes, we do go in and talk to building owners. We help them to achieve benchmarking is what we call it. Benchmarking their building would get them their EUI scores. And then we talk to them about what types of improvements that we see they could make to help lower that score. Like Chris mentioned, the Building Energy Performance Standard does have a requirement that they will set and tell each building owner about what that score or that target is that they try to achieve. And it's our job to help them out and tell them what can they do to achieve those scores and how can we get them there.
I bet everyone wants to be in the top third and not be in did you say it was like the lower two thirds
Yes.
are on the compliance end of things?
Yeah, you're right. The target there is to be in the top third, and the Building Energy Performance Standard is incentivizing those that are really trying to make strides in that direction. As I mentioned, there's more cycles of this Building Energy Performance Standard to come. There's 3 cycles that are already in play, and like I said, we're in the middle of the first one. And the city of St. Louis is incentivizing people to go beyond that. Jeremy mentioned each building gets a target EUI score, and as buildings work to push past that, they can attain compliance for future cycles as well. So getting a certain percentage further beyond the EUI target can get you compliance for the next cycle already and then beyond, which could be a very good thing, right? It's like I said, this is a sliding scale. So we don't know where this target is going to fall, where this EUI target is going to fall for the next cycle. But going a certain percentage beyond at this point will automatically gain you compliance for the next cycle, regardless of where that EUI score falls. So even the buildings that are already in that top third, the buildings that are already performing well, there's still incentive for them to look into the services and the improvements that can be made. There's still benefit to doing that.
When you talk about incentives, do you mean are there actual City of St. Louis financial incentives, or what do the incentives entail?
The incentives that Chris was talking about are incentives to bypass the compliance cycles. What he's specifically talking about is they have that EUI score that they're expecting building owners to reach. And if they can exceed that score by, I think it's 25%, then they get exempt from having to meet the next cycle's EUI score. If they can exceed it by 50%, then they get to skip the next 2 cycles EUI score. So that's the incentive from the city standpoint. There are other incentive opportunities available out there. Our local utility companies are, for the majority, we use Fire and Ameren, and both of them have utility incentive programs that do help pay for some of these projects and help them move forward with high efficient design.
I wondered if I'm a building owner and when you come in and you determine that my current energy efficiency isn't great, that's got to be for some companies or some building owners or investors even, it's got to be a big ticket item potentially if they need like a new system or a new mechanical system. Do they have and I think you already covered this, but if today you determined that I needed like a new HVAC system or something, how much time do they have to make that investment?
Yeah, and that's why we want to have this conversation early in 2024 is when we talk about this sort of equipment. We still see some longer lead times on some equipment. It's gotten a lot better post-pandemic. It was really bad there a couple of years ago where we were seeing HVAC equipment lead time in the 40, 50, 55 weeks. And it has gotten a lot better. And there's still plenty of time to get some equipment in to improve those older pieces of equipment. But One thing that we talk a lot about is the optimization of existing equipment. In some cases, the older equipment just has to come out. If it's too old, if it's too bad, if it's original to the building, there's no amount of optimization that's gonna help that. And I guess a sidestep of that, the reason that we focus so much on the HVAC equipment and the as it pertains to the building is about 40 to 60% of a building's energy use is in heating and cooling. So that's where you're going to see
Wow.
the biggest impact. This building energy performance standard also applies to things like lighting and refrigeration and that sort of stuff as well. But the real big bang for the buck and the impact that it's going to take is on the HVAC equipment. That's why companies like us are really pushing for this, is there's a lot of opportunity there to make a big impact when it comes to that equipment. Back to the question about equipment, when it comes to the optimization of existing equipment, there's a lot of savings that can be had there through building automation. And that's one of the things that we talk about quite a bit, is putting controls on the existing equipment to find ways to help improve the optimization of it. A lot of older equipment is just left to its own devices. It's turned on, it's left to run and forgotten about. And in buildings that have lower occupancy or lower occupied hours, we can see some savings in the usage that equipment has, the runtime of that equipment, by optimizing it through building automation. And like Jeremy was saying, when it comes to incentives, there's a lot of incentives out there for those types of programs because it's very easy for us to recognize the savings from it, right? We can say a piece of equipment's been running for X amount of hours. We put controls on it. We've reduced the hours by 10%, 20%, 50%. Then it's easy for us to calculate and say this is the sort of savings that we'll see. And companies like Ameren and Inspire will incentivize those projects because it's beneficial to them as well for us to reduce the energy usage.
I bet that's particularly relevant to companies that still have that sort of hybrid work model where they're not in the office 5 days a week. Why should they be heating or cooling it if it's a reduced staff? I bet that's become even more material to what you're doing,
Very
the
much so.
usage patterns.
Yeah, buildings that were at full occupancy pre-pandemic that are working hybrid or have a big remote staff now, they're not using their buildings the way that they were before. And without changing, it's still running the same as it did 4 or 5 years ago when the building was at 100% capacity.
I can imagine. What sort of impact can building owners expect to see on their, what do I keep forgetting the name of that? Their EUI, but I want to say energy utilization.
You can call it EUI. Yeah, that's what we typically go by. Nobody wants to say energy utilization index.
It's a mouthful. Yeah. So what kind of impact can building owners realize? What does that score do after they go ahead and make the changes or the controls retrofit?
Yeah, what typically would you would see is you would reassess your building. So you would monitor your building over the course of another year, and then you would benchmark your building against the original benchmark that you did prior to your project or prior to your renovation. You would compare your score, and that score would then give you an insight to how your building is operating compared to before. Now, weather has a big impact in the HVAC world and on the energy usage. So a lot of times these EUI scores we use what we call weather normalization. And so we set up a number of degree days differences from an average degree day. And we can normalize those weather conditions to take that out of the equation so that you're comparing apples to apples with your EUI score.
That makes sense. Where is St. Louis on the adoption curve or the progress on this whole benchmarking situation? Are we looked at as more of a, you mentioned there were a couple other cities in the country that are doing it. Are we more on the more proactive side according to the Green Building Council, or where would you
Yeah,
say we're at?
we're definitely ahead of the game on a lot of this. There's a few other cities that have already started to adopt these things. But yeah, I would say as a whole, St. Louis as a whole is definitely part of leading the charge when it comes to this sort of program.
If someone's a building owner and they are a commercial building owner and they're listening to this conversation, can they be pretty much located anywhere in Missouri, and you guys might be able to help them with that, or what's your territory?
Yeah, our services cover Missouri and the central and southern parts of Illinois, different services in different areas, but there's definitely an opportunity for IFS to be able to service them and service their building. This definitely goes beyond just the city of St. Louis. We focus on that for this conversation as part of the Building Energy Performance Standard, but everything we've talked about with optimization, with EUI, with energy saving retrofits and all of that is not specific to the city.
I so appreciate I could ask you questions all day if there's anything else you guys want to wrap up with, but anyone joined us later on, we've been talking and learning a great deal from Integrated Facility Services, Jeremy Welch, project engineer, and Chris Ruth, Mid-Missouri Controls Manager. And I know I've learned a lot today. What are next steps for someone listening that maybe hopefully this isn't a foreign concept, but if they're a little bit panicked that they need to get started on this, what would you suggest they do?
I would say it's not too late to get started. That's the first thing. It's coming. So regardless, they're going to have to start looking at how can they do their part and help to get compliant, whether they're in St. Louis with this ordinance in place or they're looking and they're outside of the St. Louis region and they don't have such an ordinance in place. It's the hype. It's what everybody's talking about nowadays. And I think it's everybody's seeing there is benefit to running your buildings more efficiently and optimizing your usage and getting the technologies in place that are available now to really fine tune how your building performs.
There's a lot of resources out there for buildings owners and property managers to find what they need. As I had mentioned, IFS is very interested in helping those that have needs in the HVAC, plumbing, building automation, refrigeration sector. And like I said, this kind of transcends that, right? It's a big part of it, but there's more to buildings than just their HVAC side. There's a lot of resources out there for things like lighting and building envelope and stuff that's really outside of the scope of what IFS would help with. Reaching out to the Missouri Gateway Green Building Council has a great network of professionals that can help address those concerns and help provide some resources for that. The Building Energy Exchange is another one. That's a resource hub that was created in the city of St. Louis to help through this building energy performance standard process to provide resources for building owners when they don't know where to start. But yeah, when it comes to the HVAC stuff, the heating, cooling, plumbing, refrigeration, building automation, energy management, IFS is happy to help.
Oh, awesome. Well, thanks again, Jeremy Welch and Chris Ruth with IFS Integrated Facility Services. And I know I've learned a lot today, and I hope you'll come back on again.
Yeah, we'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.